Hi, everyone, and happy week 8. This week, we have a lot on the agenda. So I would encourage you to start your preparation for Wednesday's class a little bit earlier than you might usually, because not only do we have style quiz number 1, but we also have some readings and a podcast that I'd like you to listen to before class on Wednesday. So here's what's in store. I'm going to share my screen real quickly. And our first, obviously, as I mentioned, the first task for week 8 is style quiz number 1. We talked about this last week, so we'll spend about a half hour in class working on that style quiz. Then for the rest of the class, we'll talk about understanding tropes as a stylistic rather than a structural choice. We'll talk about understanding diction's role in a writer's style. And then we're also going to be adding to our style guide using or developing some definitions and examples of the different tropes that Holcomb and Killingsworth describe. So before class on Wednesday, here's what you need to plan. So make sure that you prepare for the style quiz number 1. That'll happen in class. And I'd encourage you to review class notes, class slides that are all posted on Blackboard, and also take a look at the style glossary. I'm not going to ask you anything that we haven't covered in class. And so make sure that you're taking some time to review to prepare for that quiz. I'd also like you to read Performing Prose, Chapter 6, which is all about tropes. And then we're going to read an excerpt from Susan Orlean's book, the library book. And then I'd also like you to listen to a podcast episode from the podcast is called The Book Exploder. And she talks about the passage that we'll read. And so I would like you to kind of listen to her talk about the stylistic choices she made in the passage that we'll read and discuss. So that's what you should be ready for on Wednesday. But in terms of what we'll cover, the kind of core concepts that we'll be talking about this week, there's 2, tropes and diction. And Holcomb and Killingsworth explain that diction and tropes all sort of fall under this category about language choices that writers can make. So they can make choices in terms of diction, which is really focused on word choice, and then also figures of speech. And so this week, we're really going to be talking about diction and tropes. Next week, we'll be covering schemes. So tropes comes from the Greek word, which means to turn, to direct, to alter, or to change. And so if we think about this stylistically, we're really talking about turns of phrases, turns of thought, or turns of plot. And I think for many of us, the turn of plot is where we most often hear the idea of a trope. And so we would think about, if you think about tropes associated with the romance genre, we have enemies to friends to lovers, or the sort of vacation trope in romance where you go away and you fall in love with somebody on vacation. Or in mystery stories, we have tropes of sort of the everybody gathering together in a drawing room and then the detective suddenly explains exactly who did the murder and why. So it's these kinds of things that we're very familiar with, the story or character kinds of tropes that are part of literature that we are familiar with and that we recognize both as writers and as readers. But that is not what we're talking about when we're talking about tropes in terms of style. Instead, we're thinking specifically about turns of phrase or turns of thought that happen at the sentence level, not at the structural level of the story or the plot itself. So that's sort of just an overview of tropes. And as we talked about, it's a figure of speech that turns the meaning of a word from its conventional sense to a new or surprising meaning. And so tropes work in the textual arena, the social arena, and the cultural arena. So as I said, we'll talk about this more in class on Wednesday. But the key thing to think about here is that we're not talking about plot or character tropes. We're talking about figure of speech tropes that are focused on the sentence level, the word level kinds of discussion that we're focused on in this class. Okay, so that's concept 1. The second concept is diction. And Holcomb and Killingsworth explain that diction can be understood in a variety of ways. There can be formal diction that is usually formal language, often influenced by a formal rhetorical situation. So that could be writing to a prospective employer or giving a speech on the floor of Congress. Those could be seen as formal situations that require a kind of formal diction. And another subcategory that we are, for better or worse, very familiar with under the formal category is academic. Academic diction is formal language that is used in primarily academic settings, and it often uses jargon that is specific to a particular field or discipline. The formal diction of academic writing can be what makes it difficult to understand for people who are new to the field. And because it's using sort of elevated language and jargon that may be unfamiliar, it's why often when we read academic articles, we have to have a dictionary open so that we're continually looking up words to understand exactly what is being said. Another kind of diction that they talk about is informal. And this is what we're most used to. It's conversational, how we talk with friends, with family members, with people that we're familiar with. And informal diction can also include kind of colloquial language, which is language that is influenced by a specific region or community or even a genre. So if you think about one of the age-old questions that people ask in the Midwest is, do you call it Coke, pop, or soda, or something else? So those kinds of colloquial terms can indicate their informal diction, but they also indicate a particular region or a particular identity for the speaker, or the character, or something like that. And so that's part of what we're talking about when we're talking about informal diction. Also slang, so newly coined words or other words that are sort of new to the lexicon. So the most recent one that I've been hearing a lot about is Riz. So these are new terms that are kind of that demonstrate how language is organic and culturally constructed and socially constructed. And when we bring those into our writing, we're making specific choices about who these characters are or what kind of persona we as a writer are conveying to our readers. So they also talk about problematic diction. So when diction can actually get in the way of a writer's effort to communicate with their reader. So things like mixed construction, which there's an example of, also banished were her signature in Entourage, flashy Bentley convertible, and who can forget those mink eyelashes. So we have sort of a pattern that's set up at the first part of the sentence. Also banished were her signature Entourage, her flashy Bentley convertible, but then you add that who can forget, and so it mixes up the construction and it makes it clunky for us as readers to get through that phrase. Also things like confused words or homonyms, so things like affect versus effect, the it's or it's, there, and then and than. And so kind of misusing those words or making that kind of mistake in your diction can cause confusion for your reader. Also, and this I think is an important one, trite expressions, slang, or cliches can be really kind of problematic in a text. So if you say something like, she rescued the cat from the water with the speed of light, just in the nick of time, there's nothing new that's being shared in that sentence, except for we know what happened to the cat. But if we talk about, if we could talk about how quickly she rescued the cat in a different way, in a more interesting way or a more creative way, it conveys the same meaning, but it has a different impact on the writer. Also, their wait for the table at the restaurant lasted an eternity. Okay, great. It lasted a long time, but tell us that in a different way. Give us some other kind of language and diction to make us more interested and invested. And finally, mixing metaphors can be problematic. It can kind of create confusion for the reader and it loses the impact that a metaphor might have. So something like compounding the recessionary gloom, trade is being choked by the credit crunch, which is drying up routine export financing. So we have gloom, we have choked, we have drying up. There's three different kinds of images or metaphors that are being used that are kind of keeping us from really understanding the sentence. So instead, if we were to say something like compounding the recessionary gloom, trade is being tamped down by the credit crunch, which is diminishing, or which is I can't think of a good example for that, but which is depressing. That could be a good way, Warren. So depressing the routine export financing. So kind of picking a metaphor and staying with it through the sentence makes it more powerful than if you were to mix those metaphors of a gloomy day, something getting choked, and then something getting dried up and arid. Okay, so as you read for this week, here's some things to consider. As you're reading performing prose, think about how the author's conversation about tropes connects or compares to your previously held understanding of that term. And then also think about your own writing. How do you use tropes in your writing, or do you use tropes in your writing? Then as you read and listen to Susan Orlean's the library book excerpt, think about what you notice about Orlean's stylistic choices, and then how her description of her writing in the podcast episode affects how you understand her text overall. So after class on Wednesday, you've got our regular kind of routine of assignments. You've got 2 discussion boards for this week, and also your last commonplace book, number 5, will be due on Sunday. And we will also be workshopping your style experiment number 2. And so I would encourage you to start working on that over the weekend as well. That's not due before Sunday, but that's something to kind of keep in your back pocket as something that will be due next week. All right, so that's all I've got for you for week 8. I am looking forward to seeing you all on Wednesday, and don't hesitate to let me know if you've got any questions. Bye, everyone.